Hey guys, tonight we're going to journey back to a time when smiling could get you in trouble, and a hearty chuckle might land you in a rather uncomfortable Roman cell. Imagine, if you will, the bustling streets of ancient Rome, but instead of the usual cacophony of vendors hawking their wares and children chasing pigeons, there's an eerie quiet. The gladiators might still flex, the senators might still drone, but the underlying hum of human joy, that bright, spontaneous burst of mirth, is conspicuously absent. You trudge along the cobblestones, perhaps carrying a basket of freshly baked bread, but your shoulders are a little hunched, and your gaze is fixed on the ground. A slight upturn at the corner of your mouth, a fleeting glimpse of amusement in your eyes, you'd quickly suppress it, wouldn't you? Because, in this peculiar version of Rome, an emperor, whose name we'll whisper later, tried to ban laughter. Yes, you heard that right. Not treason, not tax evasion, but honest-to-goodness giggling. You probably wouldn't survive a day without cracking a smile, let alone a decade under such a decree. The sheer absurdity of it is almost, well, laughable, if only it weren't so utterly, wonderfully, historically true. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening, let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to imagine us all drifting off together across different time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins, as many peculiar tales do, in the opulent, yet oddly tense, halls of the Roman imperial palace. The air hangs heavy, not with the usual scent of exotic spices or fresh parchment, but with a palpable sense of restraint. You're a palace servant, perhaps, carefully carrying a tray of candied figs, your footsteps silent on the mosaic floor. Every polished marble surface reflects your own solemn expression, a perfect mirror to the reigning mood. The emperor, a figure lost to some of the grander historical narratives, yet utterly captivating in his oddity, had taken a disliking to the sound of human amusement. Historians still argue whether this was due to a deeply personal trauma, a cynical attempt at social control, or simply a prolonged period of indigestion, but the effect was undeniably profound. This wasn't just a suggestion, mind you, or a polite request to keep the noise down. This was an imperial edict, stamped with the emperor's seal, distributed by somber-faced couriers throughout the vast Roman Empire. Imagine the scene in the Forum when the decree was first read aloud, a slow, deliberate unrolling of the scroll, a hush falling over the crowd, and then the utterly baffling declaration that public displays of mirth were now, effectively, illegal. It sounds like something out of a satire, doesn't it? A Roman version of a very unfunny stand-up routine. But for the average Roman citizen, it was a sudden, jarring shift in the fabric of their daily existence. No more boisterous laughter echoing from the taverns. No more gleeful shrieks from children chasing hoops in the streets. The vibrant tapestry of Roman life, known for its loud celebrations and even louder arguments, was suddenly muted, draped in a strange, unyielding quiet. It was as if someone had turned down the volume knob on an entire civilization, leaving only the low thrum of necessity and the rustle of official decrees. The emperor, it seems, believed that silence was golden, and that laughter, perhaps, was mere tarnished silver. This peculiar decree, the imperial ban on laughter, wasn't just a fleeting thought from a grumpy ruler, it was, surprisingly, rather detailed in its lack of detail. You see, laws in ancient Rome, even the odd ones, often had a certain bureaucratic precision. But this one, it was remarkably vague on specifics, which, as you can imagine, only amplified the general unease. The edict simply stated that public expressions of mirth are hereby forbidden. What constituted public was a quiet chuckle shared with your spouse in your own peristyle garden. Considered public was a suppressed snort into your toga sleeve as your neighbor tripped over a stray dog. Forbidden, the ambiguity was, in itself, a form of soft oppression, a constant reminder that any flicker of joy could be misconstrued, misinterpreted, and thus, punished. Imagine trying to explain to a stern Roman guard that your muffled snicker was merely a polite cough. It certainly wasn't an easy time for those prone to fits of the giggles, or even just a pleasant, relaxed smile. You're now walking through the forum, usually a lively hub of political debate, commercial transactions, and social gossip. But today, the murmurs are subdued. You notice a street vendor, typically boisterous, now quietly arranging his olives, his usual booming sales pitch reduced to a low mumble. A group of senators, usually engaged in animated discussions, stand stiffly, their faces unreadable, their cloaks flapping silently in the breeze. It's as if a collective sigh has settled over the city, a heavy blanket of seriousness. Even the stray dogs seem to slink rather than trot, perhaps sensing the shift in the human mood. The decree didn't explicitly outline punishments, which made it all the more chilling. Would it be a fine, a night in the dreaded Mamertine prison, or something more? Well, Roman in its creativity, the uncertainty itself acted as a powerful deterrent. People simply didn't want to find out. This is where the human element truly shines, or perhaps, dims. How do you suppress a fundamental human instinct? Laughter, as historians and psychologists today widely agree, is an involuntary, often uncontrollable, expression of joy, amusement, or even nervousness. To ban it is akin to banning blinking or breathing, though perhaps with slightly less immediate fatal consequences. One fringe tidbit from this period suggests that some Roman citizens began to practice silent smiles, a subtle widening of the eyes, a slight crinkle at the corners, a private moment of inner amusement that outwardly appeared as nothing more than deep thought. It was a silent rebellion, a testament to the resilient human spirit's refusal to be entirely extinguished, even by an emperor obsessed with solemnity. Imagine trying to hold a straight face while witnessing something genuinely absurd, like a senator's wig flying off in a sudden gust of wind. You'd have to develop extraordinary self-control, a kind of internal emotional gymnastics, to avoid any telltale twitch. The emperor's motivations remain a point of significant scholarly debate. Some theories posit that he genuinely believed laughter was a sign of weakness, a distraction from the stoic virtues he wished to embody and impose upon his empire. Others suggest a more cynical approach, viewing the ban as a clever, albeit bizarre, means of identifying dissenters. Those who couldn't conform to the humorless new normal might be seen as less loyal. This would be a rather elaborate lie detector test, wouldn't it? Are you loyal to Rome? Prove it by not giggling at my terrible toga. Still others, perhaps more empathetically, wonder if the emperor himself was simply a deeply unhappy individual, finding the joy of others a painful reminder of his own inner turmoil. Whatever the true reason, the edict itself was a bold, unprecedented move, one that undoubtedly etched this nameless emperor's reign into the annals of Roman oddities, even if he didn't make it into the textbooks for his military victories or architectural marvels. He was, quite simply, the grumpy emperor. And his legacy a resounding silence where once there was laughter. With the emperor's decree against laughter firmly in place, life in Rome began to take on a decidedly muted hue. You, a diligent Roman citizen, would notice the change most keenly in the small, everyday interactions. Gone were the boisterous greetings in the taverny, replaced by hushed nods and whispered pleasantries. The lively banter among merchants in the forum gave way to terse negotiations, punctuated by the clinking of denarii that sounded unnervingly loud in the quiet air. Imagine trying to haggle over the price of a fine amphora of olive oil with a straight face, no playful jest, no shared chuckle over a particularly stubborn vendor. It sounds like a rather dull shopping experience, doesn't it? Even the children, usually a vibrant source of unrestrained joy, seemed affected. Their games of tail-eye knucklebones or chasing hoops were now conducted with a seriousness that belied their age. A scraped knee might elicit a quiet whimper, but certainly not a dramatic wail that might attract unwanted attention. You'd see mothers gently shushing their little ones, not for being too loud, but for merely expressing innocent delight. It was as if an invisible weight pressed down on the entire city, muffling not just sound, but spirit itself. The Roman concept of gravitas, a sense of dignity and seriousness, seemed to have been taken to an extreme, suffocating all lighter emotions. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that Roman society, while often perceived as stoic, also highly valued public spectacle and communal celebrations. Festivals like the Saturnalia, with their inversion of social norms and widespread merriment, were integral to the social fabric. The laughter ban would have fundamentally disrupted these established traditions, forcing people to find new, quieter ways to mark occasions or simply endure them with a grim determination. Historians still argue whether the emperor genuinely understood the cultural impact of his decree or if he was simply too disconnected from the daily lives of his subjects to care. It's hard to imagine a Roman Saturnalia without a single chuckle, isn't it? Perhaps it became the silent Saturnalia, a peculiar oxymoron. A quirky, fringe tidbit emerges from accounts of this period. Some wealthy Romans, desperate for any form of lightheartedness, began to commission artists to paint trompe-l'oeil frescoes on their villa walls depicting scenes of extreme silliness or slapstick comedy, intended for private, silent amusement. Imagine staring at a fresco of a Roman politician slipping on a banana peel, if they had bananas, of course, and trying to suppress a smile, your face a mask of solemnity, all in the privacy of your own dining room. It's a testament to the human need for humor, even when it has to be consumed in secret, like forbidden fruit. You might even catch yourself trying to recall a particularly amusing anecdote, only to remember the imperial decree and quickly push it from your mind. It was a constant, low-level mental exercise in self-censorship. The constant suppression of natural human expression inevitably led to a pervasive sense of anxiety. You couldn't truly relax, not entirely. Every public space became a stage where you had to perform solemnity. Imagine trying to eat a hearty Roman meal at a thermopolium, a fast food eatery, where the usual boisterous chatter of patrons and the clatter of amphorae were replaced by the polite, almost whispered requests for food. The very act of chewing seemed to echo loudly in the quiet. This enforced quietude, while perhaps intended to promote order, likely fostered a different kind of disorder beneath the surface, a quiet, simmering resentment, a longing for the simple release of a good laugh. It was a silent rebellion, fought not with swords, but with stifled smiles and hidden amusement, a constant reminder that even the most powerful emperor cannot truly control the human spirit, only its outward expression. In a city suffocated by enforced solemnity, the human spirit, ever resourceful, found whispers and smirks in the shadows. You'd become adept at reading subtle cues, a new, unspoken language developing amidst the quiet. A quick glance exchanged with a fellow citizen as a particularly pompous senator tripped ever so slightly on his toga, a barely perceptible twitch of the lips, these were the new currency of humor. Imagine trying to explain to someone from our time that a shared eye roll was considered a daring act of rebellion. It sounds rather quaint, doesn't it? But in this Rome, it was a subversive act, a silent defiance against an absurd law. The marketplaces, once vibrant with the cacophony of commerce and lively banter, became theaters of suppressed emotion. You'd see a vendor, perhaps, discreetly tuck a small, crudely carved wooden figurine of a laughing face beneath a pile of dates, a tiny, defiant protest hidden in plain sight. Or you might observe two friends, conversing in low tones, suddenly break off their conversation, their eyes darting around nervously, only to resume with a shared, almost imperceptible shrug that spoke volumes. It was a constant dance on the edge of detection, a peculiar ballet of silent communication. One mainstream historical fact from this period, even if not directly related to laughter, is the Roman fondness for satire and mime. These forms of entertainment, known for their often biting wit and physical comedy, would have faced an existential crisis under the emperor's decree. While official performances likely ceased or were heavily censored, historians still argue whether underground mime troupes continued to perform in private homes, using exaggerated gestures and silent expressions to convey forbidden humor. Imagine a mime trying to convey the absurdity of the emperor's ban through nothing but a series of tragicomic facial expressions. It's a fringe tidbit that paints a vivid picture of quiet artistic resistance. You might find yourself at one of these clandestine gatherings, huddled in a dimly lit room, holding your breath to stifle any involuntary chuckle. The act of hiding laughter wasn't without its own peculiar humor, though of a dark sort. You'd hear stories, whispered from ear to ear, of unfortunate souls who, in a moment of weakness, let out a snort or a giggle in public. The sheer absurdity of being punished for such a natural human sound must have been maddening. Some accounts, likely embellished over time, even suggest that individuals would carry small pieces of cloth to stuff into their mouths, or pretend to cough violently, as a desperate last resort to muffle an oncoming giggle. It was a rather peculiar form of social etiquette, wasn't it? "Excuse me, I seem to be having a severe attack of suppressed amusement." The very air seemed to hum with unspoken jokes. You'd pass by a public orator, delivering a particularly long and tedious speech, and you could practically feel the collective effort of the crowd to maintain their solemn expressions, even as some witty aside or unintentional double entendre might float through the air. The internal struggle to maintain composure must have been exhausting. It was a constant, low-level mental exercise, a form of self-censorship that permeated every aspect of public life. The vibrant, boisterous spirit of Rome was there, just beneath the surface, bubbling quietly, a silent, persistent rebellion against an emperor who dared to outlaw joy itself. The emperor's grim decree cast a long, somber shadow, particularly within the walls of the imperial court itself. You can imagine the atmosphere, a gilded cage, opulent yet suffocating. The air, usually thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the murmur of high-stakes political maneuvering, now felt heavy with an unspoken tension. Courtiers, accustomed to flattering smiles and jovial backslapping, now moved with stiff, almost wooden solemnity. Every glance, every gesture, was carefully measured, lest it betray even a flicker of amusement. It was a bizarre pantomime, a play where everyone was performing the role of the perpetually serious. The emperor himself, no doubt, set the tone. His frown, likely a permanent fixture, would have been mirrored by his closest advisors. Imagine being a jester in this court. Your entire profession, your very purpose, was to induce laughter. Now, you'd be redundant, a relic of a bygone era. Perhaps you'd be reassigned to polishing the imperial silver, or given the grim task of documenting the emperor's increasingly monotonous decrees. It makes you wonder how long one could maintain such an artificial demeanor before cracking, doesn't it? The strain of constant emotional suppression must have been immense. One mainstream historical fact to consider is the intense pressure and intrigue that already characterized Roman imperial courts. Courtiers lived in a perpetual state of anxiety, vying for favor and avoiding the emperor's wrath. Adding a ban on laughter to this volatile mix would have amplified the paranoia. A misread smile could be construed as mockery, a stifled giggle as disrespect. Historians still argue whether this particular emperor used the laughter ban as a deliberate tool to exert even greater control, fostering an environment of fear where genuine emotion was seen as a dangerous vulnerability. It's a chilling thought, turning natural human expression into a political liability. A quirky, fringe tidbit suggests that some courtiers, desperate for any form of emotional release, took to secretly indulging in excessively sweet and rich foods, finding a tiny, fleeting pleasure in forbidden desserts. Imagine sneaking a piece of honey-soaked cake under your toga, the sweet taste a brief, private rebellion against the pervasive gloom. Or perhaps they adopted peculiar, ritualistic forms of silent self-amusement, like mentally recounting complex mathematical problems or reciting epic poetry to themselves, anything to distract from the emotional void. It's a rather sad image, isn't it? A court full of powerful individuals, reduced to seeking solace in surreptitious sugary treats. The imperial ban also highlighted the precarious position of women in the court. While often influential behind the scenes, their public demeanor was highly regulated. Now, they too had to adopt this solemn facade. What did private life look like? Did wives and husbands dare to share a quiet laugh behind closed doors, or did the fear permeate even the most intimate spaces? The constant vigilance must have been exhausting, a mental burden that never truly lifted. It's hard to imagine enduring years, perhaps even decades, under such a heavy cloak of forced seriousness. The very air inside the palace walls would have felt thin, difficult to breathe, devoid of the natural lightness that laughter brings. Amidst the oppressive quiet of the Roman Empire, as decreed by our laughter-averse emperor, you might find yourself turning to the intellectual elite, the philosophers and scholars, hoping they might offer some reasoned discourse, some eloquent argument against this peculiar ban. But even in their hallowed halls, the debate about mirth took on a different, more somber tone. Instead of hearty intellectual jests punctuated by shared amusement, discussions became hushed, ponderous affairs. You'd observe a philosopher, perhaps a Stoic, meticulously articulating why laughter was a trivial, even dangerous, distraction from the pursuit of virtue. It was a rather convenient philosophical alignment, wouldn't you say, especially when the alternative might be a public scolding, or worse. The prevailing philosophical currents of the time, particularly Stoicism, emphasized self-control, reason, and detachment from excessive emotion. For a Stoic, external expressions of extreme joy or sorrow were seen as disruptions to inner tranquility. So, from their perspective, an emperor banning laughter might not have seemed entirely out of left field, but rather a logical, if extreme, extension of their own principles. Imagine trying to argue with a Stoic about the inherent goodness of a belly laugh. You'd likely be met with a serene, unblinking stare and a lengthy discourse on the fleeting nature of pleasure. One mainstream historical fact relevant here is the influence of Greek philosophical thought on Roman intellectuals. Concepts like ataraxia, freedom from disturbance, and apatheia, freedom from passion, were highly prized. Laughter, in this context, could easily be categorized as a pathos, an emotion that needed to be managed or even suppressed. Historians still argue whether the emperor himself was a fervent adherent of a particular school of philosophy that led him to this extreme view, or if the philosophical arguments simply provided a convenient justification for his personal aversion to mirth. It's almost as if he commissioned a philosophical backing for his bad mood. A quirky, fringe tidbit suggests that some philosophers, perhaps secretly despairing of the humorless age, began to invent complex logical paradoxes and riddles, sharing them not for the joy of solving them, but for the sheer mental exercise of untangling them. It was a way to keep their minds engaged, a substitute for the intellectual stimulation that might otherwise come from lively, often humorous, debates. Imagine trying to solve a particularly convoluted riddle about a centurion, a donkey, and a missing amphora of wine, all without cracking a single smile. It sounds less like intellectual pursuit and more like a high-stakes mental endurance test. You might even overhear hushed debates among students in the Roman academies. Is a silent smile truly a smile, or can one experience true joy without its outward expression? These were not abstract academic exercises, but deeply personal questions that touched upon the very essence of human experience under this oppressive decree. The intellectual landscape of Rome, typically vibrant and argumentative, had become a quiet, inward-looking realm, meticulously dissecting the nature of emotion without daring to fully express it. The irony, of course, was that the very act of pondering laughter's existence, in its absence, only highlighted its profound importance. Despite the emperor's best efforts to silence joy, laughter, like water, found its cracks. You see, the human spirit has an uncanny knack for rebellion, especially when something as fundamental as a good chuckle is forbidden. These weren't grand, organized protests, mind you, but rather small, unlikely eruptions of mirth that poked holes in the emperor's grim decree. Imagine a market square, hushed and solemn, when suddenly a trained monkey, part of a street performer's act though perhaps now renamed a solemn primate demonstrator, accidentally snatched a wig right off a patrician's head, revealing a surprisingly bald pate. For a split second, before the fear could fully set in, a ripple of suppressed snorts might have run through the crowd, quickly stifled, but undeniably present. It was a fleeting, shared moment of forbidden amusement. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that human societies, throughout history, have always found ways to cope with oppressive regimes, often through humor or satire. Even under the harshest dictatorships, jokes circulate in whispers, offering a tiny act of defiance and a release valve for collective frustration. Historians still argue about the precise mechanisms through which these unlikely laughter rebellions spread in ancient Rome. Was it through exaggerated whispers in bathhouses, or perhaps through cryptic gestures passed between close friends? It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? A silent network of shared amusement, thriving beneath the surface of enforced solemnity. A quirky, fringe tidbit suggests that some Roman actors, finding their usual comedic roles curtailed, began to subtly incorporate elements of silent physical comedy into their dramatic performances. A particularly clumsy senator in a play might stumble in such a way that it was almost, but not quite, genuinely funny, allowing the audience a moment of internal amusement that they could deny if questioned. Or a character might deliver a supposedly serious line with a facial expression so exaggeratedly somber that it veered into the absurd, prompting a tiny, internal chuckle from the more perceptive audience members. It was a clever, almost invisible, way of keeping humor alive, like planting tiny, hidden seeds of joy in a desolate landscape. You might find yourself at such a performance, your face carefully blank, but your mind racing with the delicious, silent comedy unfolding before you. You might even hear stories, passed around with a mixture of awe and nervous amusement, of children who, in their innocence, simply forgot the ban. A child, spotting a particularly silly dog chasing its tail, might let out a spontaneous peal of giggles. The collective gasp from the adults would be immediate, followed by a frantic shushing and hurried efforts to distract the innocent offender. These moments, though quickly suppressed, served as powerful reminders of what had been lost, and perhaps, what could be regained. They were tiny cracks in the wall of silence, allowing just a sliver of human warmth to seep through. It was a constant battle between natural human instinct and the emperor's peculiar decree, a battle that, in these small, unexpected bursts, laughter often won, even if just for a fleeting second. As you reflect on the peculiar decree against laughter, a natural question arises: what kind of man issues such an edict? While history often focuses on the grand narratives of emperors, their conquests, their building projects, their political maneuvers, the private lives and early experiences of these powerful figures can offer fascinating, if speculative, insights. For our laughter-averse emperor, one might wonder if his aversion to mirth stemmed from an unhappy childhood, a formative period devoid of joy. Imagine a young Roman boy, perhaps born into immense privilege, yet surrounded by a pervasive sternness. Perhaps his parents were unusually strict, emphasizing duty and decorum above all else, seeing any form of lightheartedness as a sign of weakness or frivolity. It's a compelling, if unprovable, theory, that the seeds of his later decree were sown in a joyless youth. Mainstream historical understanding suggests that Roman aristocratic upbringing could indeed be quite rigorous, focusing on discipline, military training for boys, and adherence to strict social codes. Humor, while present in Roman society, was often reserved for specific contexts, like the biting wit of a satirist or the slapstick of a theatrical performance. But the emperor's decree went far beyond mere decorum. It was an outright ban on a fundamental human expression. Historians still argue whether the emperor's unusual stance was a deeply personal psychological issue, perhaps a form of melancholy or anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure, or if it was a calculated political move to project an image of supreme, unyielding authority. It's difficult to separate the man from the policy, isn't it? A quirky, fringe tidbit, often whispered among scholars, suggests a rather unusual incident in the emperor's youth. The story goes that as a young boy, during a particularly important public ceremony, he was accidentally doused with a bucket of cold water by a clumsy servant. The crowd, in a moment of thoughtless amusement, erupted in laughter. The young boy, humiliated and drenched, apparently never forgot the sting of that public mirth directed at him. While likely apocryphal, such tales offer a fascinating glimpse into the psychological motivations we often project onto historical figures. Imagine that scene: the chill of the water, the heat of embarrassment, and the echoing sound of laughter, a sound that, from that day forward, perhaps became intrinsically linked to pain and humiliation for him. You can almost picture it, a solitary child, playing in a vast, echoing villa, preferring the company of dusty scrolls to the boisterous games of other children. Perhaps he was always an outsider, finding comfort in silence and order, and seeing the spontaneity of laughter as disruptive, even chaotic. The emperor, as an adult, may have genuinely believed that a humorless populace was a more orderly, more manageable populace. A population too busy laughing, perhaps, was a population not paying enough attention to his decrees, or, worse, not sufficiently awed by his power. It's a rather cynical view of governance, but one that certainly fits the outcome of his peculiar edict. The absence of laughter became a tool of control, a constant reminder of imperial authority, even if it turned his magnificent empire into a place of pervasive gloom. With the imperial decree against laughter firmly in place, the true challenge lay in its enforcement. How, exactly, do you police a suppressed giggle? The methods employed were often as peculiar as the law itself, leading to absurd scenarios that, ironically, would have been ripe for comedy in a less humorless age. You can imagine the Roman guards, typically tasked with maintaining order and apprehending serious criminals, now finding themselves in the bizarre position of being laughter detectors. Their new uniform might as well have included oversized ears and perpetually suspicious expressions. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that Roman law enforcement, while effective in many areas, relied heavily on public reporting and the testimony of witnesses. This meant that the laughter ban likely turned neighbor against neighbor, as fear of punishment might compel some to report even the slightest infraction. Imagine your grumpy upstairs neighbor, who always complained about your late-night lyre playing, now having legal grounds to report you for a sudden, muffled snort. It would have created an atmosphere of pervasive distrust, turning even the most innocent interactions into potential traps. A quirky, fringe tidbit suggests that some imperial agents were trained in the art of facial micro-expression analysis, long before modern psychology. They would scrutinize faces in public, looking for the telltale crinkling around the eyes, the slight upward twitch of a lip, or the barely perceptible flush that often accompanies suppressed amusement. Imagine trying to maintain a perfectly neutral expression while a stern-faced Roman official stares intently at your face, searching for any flicker of joy. It sounds like an incredibly awkward, anxiety-inducing stare-down contest, doesn't it? One wrong muscle twitch, and you could be facing a rather unpleasant interrogation about your feelings of amusement. The punishments for laughter, while rarely leading to public executions, were often designed to be humiliating or inconvenient, serving as public deterrents. Perhaps a public shaming, where you'd be forced to stand in the forum for an hour, your face painted with a permanently solemn expression, while passers-by stared. Or maybe a rather unpleasant task, like cleaning out the public latrines for a week, all while maintaining a serious demeanor. Historians still argue about the precise penalties, as official records of such minor, peculiar infractions are sparse. It makes you wonder, though, if the guards themselves ever struggled to maintain their own solemnity when witnessing some truly absurd enforcement scenario. Perhaps they, too, had their own secret, silent smiles. You can picture a guard, trying desperately not to laugh as he admonishes an old woman for chuckling at a particularly clumsy pigeon, his own lips twitching imperceptibly. The very act of enforcing such a silly law must have been, in itself, a form of torture for anyone with a modicum of humor. The imperial ban on laughter, for all its oppressive weight, inadvertently fostered a vibrant, if hidden, cultural phenomenon, the underground comedy scene. You can imagine it, can't you? Not glittering amphitheaters or grand public stages, but hushed gatherings in the back rooms of taverns after closing time, or in the dimly lit basements of sympathetic patrician villas. Here, under the cloak of secrecy, the forbidden joy of humor found its voice again. Imagine slipping into one of these gatherings, the air thick with the scent of stale wine and nervous anticipation, a single oil lamp casting flickering shadows on hushed faces. This wasn't polished stand-up, but something far more intimate and immediate. Jokes were shared in whispers, often revolving around the absurdity of the emperor's decree itself. Why did the senator cross the road because he couldn't laugh on this side? Such simple gags, utterly unremarkable in a normal society, became acts of daring defiance. Imagine the nervous energy in the room, the collective effort to suppress audible guffaws, transforming them into silent, shaking shoulders or tears of mirth silently streaming down cheeks. The very act of sharing a forbidden joke strengthened bonds, creating a community of silent conspirators against the empire's gloom. One mainstream historical fact is that secret societies and underground gatherings were not uncommon in Roman history, often for religious or political reasons. This particular period, however, might have seen the rise of clandestine groups formed purely for the purpose of emotional release. Historians still argue about the extent and organization of these comedy clubs. Were they truly organized networks, or just spontaneous outbreaks of shared amusement among trusted friends? It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? A secret handshake not of loyalty, but of shared, stifled giggles. You might even find yourself practicing your silent laugh in front of a polished bronze mirror, preparing for your next clandestine gathering. A quirky, Fringe tidbit suggests that some clever Romans invented silent performance art during this time. Imagine a performer, perhaps a disgraced mime, using exaggerated facial expressions and gestures to tell a comedic story, with the audience responding only through their own internal amusement, perhaps signaled by a slight nod or a barely perceptible widening of the eyes. This would require incredible skill from the performer and profound self-control from the audience. It was a bizarre twist on entertainment, where the success of the performance was measured not by applause, but by the trembling shoulders and teary eyes of the silent spectators. The risk, of course, was always present. A sudden raid, a single betraying snort, and the evening's entertainment could quickly turn into a very unfunny trip to the local prison. The constant tension of these gatherings, the thrill of shared risk, must have made the forbidden laughter all the sweeter. It was a testament to the indomitable human need for humor, a deep-seated instinct that even an emperor, for all his power, could not truly extinguish. The underground comedy scene became a quiet, defiant heartbeat in the otherwise solemn pulse of Rome, proving that while laughter could be banned, the spirit of amusement could never truly be silenced. In an empire where laughter was deemed illegal, what became of the figures traditionally charged with providing it? The jesters, the fools, the comedic performers, their very existence seemed to contradict the emperor's grim decree. You might picture them, these once vibrant characters, now wandering the palace halls like ghosts, their colorful attire faded, their bells silenced. Their role, once to induce uproarious laughter from the emperor and his court, was now obsolete. It's a rather tragic image, isn't it? A clown with no audience, a jester with no jokes. Mainstream historical knowledge tells us that jesters, or court fools, played a complex role in many ancient and medieval courts. They were often the only ones who could speak truth to power, cloaking their criticisms in humor. Under our particular Roman emperor, this crucial societal safety valve would have been sealed shut. Imagine a jester trying to offer a witty critique of the emperor's latest, most somber edict, only to be met with stony silence and stern glares. Their very function, their unique license to mock and amuse, would have been brutally suppressed. Historians still argue whether the emperor, in his ban on laughter, also systematically purged his court of these figures, perhaps fearing their influence or simply finding their presence an irritating reminder of the joy he sought to extinguish. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this period suggests that some jesters, unable to practice their traditional craft, turned to more subtle forms of performance. Instead of jokes, they might have specialized in complex riddles that hinted at humor without ever overtly expressing it, leaving the audience to find the amusement internally. Or perhaps they became masters of silent physical comedy, using exaggerated gestures and expressions that, while conveying a humorous narrative, produced no sound that could be interpreted as laughter. Imagine a jester performing a slow-motion, highly dramatic mime of a fly buzzing around the emperor's nose, trying to elicit internal chuckles without a single sound escaping the audience. It was a peculiar evolution of their craft, a testament to their resilience and desperate need to perform. You might see one of these former jesters, now dressed in drab robes, walking through the marketplace, a faint, melancholic smile playing on their lips, a shadow of their former joyous self. The absence of jesters and fools would have had a profound impact on the court. Without the occasional lightheartedness or the sharp, jester-delivered truth, the atmosphere would have grown even heavier, more suffocating. The emperor himself would have been insulated from any genuine feedback, his solemn worldview reinforced by the compliant silence of those around him. It paints a picture of increasing isolation for the ruler, surrounded by a court that mirrored his own grim demeanor, locked in a cycle of solemnity. The very figures meant to bring levity had either adapted to silence, vanished, or become mere shadows, their absence a constant, quiet reminder of the emperor's peculiar obsession. You might not immediately think of the economic repercussions of a laughter ban, but in ancient Rome, where social life and commerce were so intertwined, the emperor's peculiar decree undoubtedly cast a long, gloomy shadow over the marketplace. Imagine the forum, usually a bustling hub of lively transactions and cheerful haggling, now muted. The energy that fuels commerce, often buoyed by good spirits and pleasant interactions, would have been severely dampened. You'd find merchants, typically boisterous and eager to engage, now standing with folded arms, their faces impassive, awaiting silent customers. It was a rather dreary way to do business, wouldn't you agree? Mainstream economic history confirms that consumer confidence and general sentiment can significantly impact trade. In a society where even a smile is suspect, people might become more risk-averse, less inclined to spend on non-essentials, or even to engage in lively bartering. Imagine trying to sell a particularly ornate piece of jewelry or a vibrant mosaic tile to someone who fears showing any outward pleasure at the purchase. The joy of acquisition, a powerful economic driver, would have been severely curtailed. Historians still argue whether this quiet depression had a measurable impact on Rome's overall economy, or if its resilience simply absorbed the blow, treating it as yet another peculiar imperial eccentricity. It's a subtle form of economic malaise, isn't it? A society that frowns on joy might find its coffers feeling a bit lighter too. A quirky, fringe tidbit suggests that some clever entrepreneurs, adapting to the humorless market, began to specialize in necessity goods rather than luxury items, or goods that could be exchanged with minimal interaction. Imagine a vendor dealing exclusively in grains and staple foods, where transactions were quick and emotionless. Or perhaps a sudden rise in the demand for muted, drab clothing, as bright colors and flamboyant styles might inadvertently attract attention or suggest a forbidden lightheartedness. It was a market driven by survival and discretion, not by delight. You might find yourself purchasing a plain, undecorated tunic, even if your heart yearned for a splash of color, simply to blend in and avoid suspicion. The very atmosphere of sadness could make people less productive. A happy worker, so the modern adage goes, is a productive worker. Imagine an entire workforce, from the humble artisan crafting pottery to the meticulous scribe copying manuscripts, operating under a pall of enforced solemnity. The creative spark, the spontaneous idea, the collaborative energy that often arises from relaxed, even humorous, interactions, would have been suppressed. This wasn't just about public displays of joy, it was about the insidious creep of gloom into every corner of daily life, impacting morale and, by extension, output. It's a fascinating thought experiment. How much does a society's overall mood contribute to its economic vitality? In the case of our Roman emperor, it seems, the cost of a humorless empire might have been more than just social, it might have been surprisingly fiscal too. The ripple effect of the emperor's laughter ban extended far beyond the immediate confines of Rome, touching even the delicate dance of foreign diplomacy. You can imagine envoys from distant lands arriving at the imperial court, accustomed to elaborate banquets and polite, if sometimes forced, pleasantries. Suddenly, they found themselves in an atmosphere thick with solemnity, where a diplomatic jest could be misconstrued as a grave insult, and a hearty laugh seen as a sign of disrespect. It must have been utterly baffling for them, navigating this strange, humorless new Rome. Consider an ambassador from, say, Parthia, a region known for its sophisticated courtly traditions. This ambassador might have prepared witty remarks, diplomatic metaphors, and even brought gifts intended to evoke a smile. Now, faced with a stone-faced emperor and an equally grim court, every word would have to be chosen with extreme caution. Imagine trying to negotiate a complex trade treaty when you can't even offer a polite chuckle at your counterpart's dry wit. It sounds like a recipe for diplomatic blunders, doesn't it? The smooth flow of international relations often relies on unspoken social cues, and a ban on one of the most universal expressions of goodwill would have created significant friction. One mainstream historical fact is that Roman diplomatic relations were often a mix of negotiation and the projection of power. While serious matters were always at hand, a certain degree of ceremonial bonhomie often smoothed the edges. Historians still argue whether foreign dignitaries found the Roman court's humorless demeanor intimidating or simply bizarre. Did it enhance Rome's image as a stern, unyielding power, or did it make them seem unsophisticated and rigid? You might hear whispers from visiting dignitaries about the silent Romans, a new, strange reputation for the once vibrant empire. A quirky, fringe tidbit suggests that some foreign envoys, baffled by the lack of laughter, began to send back reports to their home courts speculating on the emperor's mental state. Some theorized he was perpetually ill, others that he was under a curse, and a few even suggested he was secretly a robot, incapable of human emotion. Imagine the frantic dispatches, the Emperor of Rome. He does not laugh. His face is like stone. Is this a new form of Roman aggression? These misunderstandings, born from the simple absence of a smile, could have easily escalated tensions or led to comical diplomatic missteps. It was a rather peculiar way to conduct international relations, by turning every meeting into a solemn, almost funereal, affair. The Roman reputation for imposing its will might have been reinforced by this grim new facade. Foreigners might have perceived the lack of humor as a sign of unshakable resolve, even if it was merely the result of one man's peculiar hang-up. But you can also imagine the relief among foreign envoys when their diplomatic duties were concluded, and they could finally return to their own courts, where a shared joke or a hearty laugh wasn't a potentially punishable offense. The very air they breathed upon leaving Rome would have felt lighter, almost like a physical release from the heavy cloak of silence. No law, however strictly enforced, can truly suppress a fundamental human instinct indefinitely, and so it was with the Roman emperor's peculiar ban on laughter. You can imagine the slow, almost imperceptible unraveling of this absurd decree. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic repeal, but rather a gradual decay, like an old building slowly crumbling, brick by silent brick. Perhaps the emperor himself grew weary of the pervasive gloom, or perhaps his advisers, emboldened by time and sheer weariness, began to subtly suggest the impracticality of such a far-reaching law. One mainstream historical fact is that even the most autocratic Roman emperors faced limitations on their power, whether from the Senate, the military, or simply the immense logistical challenge of governing such a vast empire. Maintaining a universal ban on something as intangible as laughter would have been an administrative nightmare, a constant drain on resources, and a source of low-level resentment across all social strata. Historians still argue about the exact catalyst for the ban's decline. Was it a shift in imperial policy, a new advisor with a slightly less grim outlook, or simply the sheer exhaustion of trying to police every twitch of a smile? It's hard to keep an entire empire from giggling forever. Isn't it a quirky, fringe tidbit suggests that the ban began to soften first in the furthest reaches of the empire, in provinces where imperial authority was naturally less immediate and fervent. Imagine a small Roman garrison in Britannia, far from the emperor's watchful eye, where a quiet chuckle might occasionally escape, quickly forgiven by a weary centurion. As these minor infractions went unpunished, word would slowly trickle back to Rome, creating small cracks in the facade of solemnity. It was like a slow, silent wave of mild defiance, gradually making its way back to the heart of the empire. You might find yourself in a provincial town, observing a local official pretend not to notice a fleeting smile, a tiny sign that the grip of the decree was loosening. The sheer impracticality of consistent enforcement also played a significant role. How many guards could truly be dedicated to tracking down silent smirks? The novelty of the peculiar law would have worn off, even for those tasked with upholding it. Imagine a tired guard, after a long day of patrolling the quiet streets, simply turning a blind eye to a friend's quick, suppressed chuckle over a shared anecdote. These small acts of benign neglect would have accumulated, slowly eroding the decree's authority. The emperor might still have maintained his personal aversion to laughter, but the empire itself was slowly, quietly, beginning to remember how to breathe, and perhaps, how to even let out a small, quiet sigh of amusement. The weight was lifting, not with a bang, but with a barely audible whisper. The long, quiet night of the laughter ban eventually gave way to the soft, tentative dawn of its return. You can almost feel the collective exhale as the heavy cloak of solemnity began to lift from Roman society. It wasn't a sudden burst of joyous revelry, but a gradual reacquaintance with mirth, a slow unfolding of smiles and soft chuckles. Imagine, one day, you might hear a child's genuine giggle echoing, not with fear, but with a surprising lightness, and realize that no one is shushing them anymore. It was like the first tentative birdsong after a long, silent winter. The re-emergence of laughter was subtle, a testing of the waters. Perhaps it began with quiet smiles shared in private homes, then soft titters in the quieter corners of the market, before slowly, cautiously, expanding into more public spaces. It was a societal learning curve, rediscovering how to express joy without fear of reprisal. Imagine seeing an old man, who had lived through the era of enforced solemnity, let out a hearty laugh at a street performer's antics, his eyes wide with a mixture of delight and disbelief. It was a quiet triumph, a reaffirmation of the human spirit's inherent need for levity.